This is tape 130A. We're going to be beginning applications, and in today's lesson we're going to talk about number and area applications. So we're going to begin with number applications. Most of the number problems we're going to do are really just translation problems. You just look at the words and translate into symbols and see what kind of equation you have. Here's the first one we're going to look at. The square, and everybody needs to write these problems down, so you'll have them in your notes when you're doing homework. The square of a negative number is 28 more than 3 times the negative number. Find the number. The square of a negative number is 28 more than 3 times the negative number. Find the number. The thing that makes this problem a little bit tricky, generally when people are trying to translate this, is when you see something like negative number in the middle of the problem, it makes you want to do something different when you're assigning variables, but you don't do that. You still let x equal to the negative number. Even though you want to put a negative somewhere, you don't do that. You just let x be your negative number and translate with x's in there. And then when you get to work your problem out, when you get your final answers, what will happen is we'll get 2 answers. One of them will probably be negative and one of them will probably be positive, and we'll just take the negative one to use for our answer. So you don't let, if this says negative or positive and you're translating, don't let that bother you. Just go ahead and translate. So let's see if we can translate this. Now, one thing everybody needs to make sure they do on all of these word problems today, before you start them, you write what x is going to stand for. Don't start setting up your equation. Write what x is going to stand for. So, if we're going to use x, every time it says negative number, and it tells us to do the square of a negative number, what are we going to write down? X squared. X squared. And when you come to the word is, generally in a word problem, is your what? Equals. So it's the square of a negative number is 28 more than 3 times the negative number. How do we do 28 more than 3 times the negative number? (3x plus 28). Generally with more, we put the more at the end. With less, if it had said 28 less, you'd have to put minus 28 at the end. So we generally do more the same way. So 28 more than 3 times the negative number. Here's the 3 times the negative number, and here's the 28 more. So I'm going to write the problem up here so we can all see it. X squared equals to 3x plus 28. That's our translation. Now all we have to do is solve that. And that's not a very hard quadratic equation to solve. What would we do? We want it to equal to 0. That's right. So we move everything to one side. So we're going to subtract the 3x and subtract the 28. So we're going to end up with x squared minus 3x minus 28 equals to 0. And at this point in a quadratic equation from these word problems, you're going to have 2 choices. You're either going to use the quadratic formula or you're going to factor. And you'll find in some of them, even some of the ones we do today, your numbers will be too big to factor, so we'll be stuck with the quadratic formula. But in this one, do you think we can factor? 28 is pretty small, so let's see if we can come up with some factors. Okay, we know for x squared, it's got to be x and x. If it's a negative, that tells us what? Signs are different, so I'm going to put 1 plus and 1 minus. And what factors of 28 would give us that 3 in the middle? 7. Plus 7 minus 4. Will that do it? No, because we need to reverse those. So that when I do my outsides, I have 4x, my insides negative 7x, and that will give us our negative 3x. So that's the way we want them. So then we set those equal to 0 to get our answers. So what will be our two answers? One answer will be 7. The other answer will be negative 4. Okay, now's when you go back and look at your original problem and see what it said as far as whether you want both of these answers. If the problem just said the square of a number is 28 more than 3 times the number, then both of these numbers would be okay for answers. But since it says the square of a negative number, we only use the negative answer. We only use the negative answer. Now, if you want to check and see if that's a sensible answer, go back and look at your problem. In fact, let me just come back over here and do that. I'm going to go back over here and look at our problem, and what we think the answer is, I'm going to say check negative 4. Check negative 4. If we just went back and read this, it says the square of a negative number means if we take that negative 4 and square it, we're going to get 16. And that is supposed to be 28 more than 3 times our negative number. So 28 more than 3 times that negative number should give us the 16. And if you look at that and we work it out, you'll see that we will get 16. So it is a reasonable answer. I mean, it does check. So on all your homework problems, look out for things like negative and positive here. Doesn't affect how you set it up, but it affects your final answer. Affects your final answer. The next kind of number problem we want to do are some consecutive integer problems. We have 3 kinds of consecutive integer problems. We have consecutive even, consecutive odd, and just plain consecutive. And you're going to have word problems that will talk about maybe the sum of 2 consecutive even numbers, or the product of 2 consecutive odd numbers, or the difference of just consecutive numbers. So what you're going to need to know is what to do to represent those numbers. How are you going to represent the numbers you're looking for? So there's actually, we can actually talk about that before we even worry about our problems. So let's think about consecutive even. If I wanted to just give you an example of some even numbers, if I started with 20, what would be the next consecutive even numbers after 20? 22 and 24. Those would be like 3 if I wanted just to put 3 down. If I was going to let x stand for my first one, if I want to let x be my first even one, what would I have to do like to that 20 to get 22? Have to add 2 to it. So x plus 2 would be my second even. To get the next one, I've got to add 2 more. So my third one would be x plus 4 would be my third one. Each time you add 2 to what you had before to get the next one. So if you're doing consecutive even, they're going to be represented by x, x plus 2, and x plus 4. If you had 3 of them. If you had 4 of them, what would the next one be? X plus 6. X plus 6. Okay, so it depends upon what your problem says. If you had consecutive odd, for example, 15, 17, and 19 are consecutive odd. If I let x be my first odd, what do odd numbers differ by? They differ by what? You add 2 to 15 to get 17. So x plus 2 would be the second odd, and x plus 4 would be the third odd. Now, it bothers some people that you do your even and odd ones the same way, but what happens is it depends on what you start with. If you start with an even number and add 2, you get another even. If you start with an odd number and add 2, you get another odd. Now, the other thing you're going to have sometimes will be just plain consecutive, where it doesn't say even and odd, it just says consecutive. So if I just had consecutive integers, like 17, 18, and 19, instead of doing x plus 2, and x plus 4, I would let x be my first, but what would my second one be?